The letter of Aristeas. Chapter 4:17. There are many openings for water at the base of the altar which are invisible to all except to those who are engaged in the ministration, so that all the blood of the sacrifices which is collected in great quantities is washed away in the twinkling of an eye. Such is my opinion with regard to the character of the reservoirs, and I will now show you how it was confirmed. They led me more than 4 furlongs outside the city, and bade me peer down towards a certain spot, and listen to the noise that was made by the meeting of the waters, so that the great size of the reservoirs became manifest to me, as has already been pointed out. The ministration of the priests is in every way unsurpassed, both for its physical endurance and for its orderly and silent service. For they all work spontaneously, though it entails much painful exertion, and each one has a special task allotted to him. The service is carried on without interruption. Some provide the wood, others the oil, others the fine wheat flour, others the spices, others again bring the pieces of flesh for the burnt offering, exhibiting a wonderful degree of strength. For they take up with both hands the limbs of a calf, each of them weighing more than 2 talents, and throw them with each hand in a wonderful way onto the high place of the altar, and never miss placing them on the proper spot. In the same way the pieces of the sheep and also of the goats are wonderful, both for their weights and their fatness. For those whose business it is always select the beasts which are without blemish and specially fat. And thus the sacrifice which I have described is carried out. There is a special place set apart for them to rest in, where those who are relieved from duty sit. When this takes place, those who have already rested and are ready to resume their duties rise up spontaneously, since there is no one to give orders with regard to the arrangement of the sacrifices. The most complete silence reigns, so that one might imagine that there was not a single person present, though there are actually 700 men engaged in the work, besides the vast number of those who are occupied in bringing up the sacrifices. Everything is carried out with reverence and in a way worthy of the great God. We were greatly astonished when we saw Eleazar engaged in the ministration, at the mode of his dress, and at the majesty of his appearance, which was revealed in the robe which he wore and the precious stones upon his person. There were golden bells upon the garment, which reached down to his feet, giving forth a peculiar kind of melody. And on both sides of them there were pomegranates with variegated flowers of a wonderful hue. He was girded with a girdle of conspicuous beauty, woven in the most beautiful colors. On his breast he wore the oracle of God, as it is called, on which 12 stones of different kinds were inset, fastening together with gold, containing the names of the leaders of the tribes, according to their original order, each one flashing forth in an indescribable way its own particular color. On his head he wore a tiara, as it is called, and upon this in the middle of his forehead an inimitable turban, the royal diadem full of glory with the name of God inscribed in sacred letters on a plate of gold, having been judged worthy to wear these emblems in the ministrations. Their appearance created such awe and confusion of mind as to make one feel that one had come into the presence of a man who belonged to a different world. I am convinced that any one who takes part in the spectacle which I have described will be filled with astonishment and indescribable wonder, and be profoundly affected in his mind at the thought of the sanctity which is attached to each detail of the service. But in order that we might gain complete information, we ascended to the summit of the neighboring citadel and looked around us. It is situated in a very lofty spot and is fortified with many towers which have been built up to the very top of immense stones, with the object, as we were informed, of guarding the temple precincts, so that if there were an attack or an insurrection or an onslaught of the enemy, no one would be able to force an entrance within the walls that surround the temple. On the towers of the citadel, engines of war were placed, and different kinds of machines, and the position was much higher than the circle of walls which I have mentioned. The towers were guarded, too, by most trusty men who had given the utmost proof of their loyalty to their country. These men were never allowed to leave the citadel, except on feast days and then only in detachments, nor did they permit any stranger to enter it. They were also very careful, when any command came from the chief officer, to admit any visitors to inspect the place. As our own experience taught us, they were very reluctant to admit us, although we were but two unarmed men, to view the offering of the sacrifices, and they asserted that they were bound by an oath when the trust was committed to them, for they had all sworn and were bound to carry out the oath sacredly to the letter, that though they were 500 in number, they would not permit more than 5 men to enter at one time. The citadel was the special protection of the temple, and its founder had fortified it so strongly that it might efficiently protect it. Now, in relating this, I'm not justifying what happened around Josephus. Chapter 5, and much, much less what's happened in the past 70-something years. A description of the city and the countryside. Compare verse 11 with the conditions of today. Verses 39 to 41 reveal how the ancients estimate a scholar and a gentleman. 50 verses, and that sort of thing too. If something is spiritual literature, kind of the point is not just, well, it happened somewhere else. No, it's just about, we're supposed to refer to it to today. Have we figured out how right or wrong they were in this particular respect? And it's definitely more than even that. What would be good to do with it? The size of the city is of moderate dimensions. It is about 40 furlongs in circumference, as far as one could conjecture. It has its towers arranged in the shape of a theater, with thoroughfares leading between them. Now, the crossroads of the lower towers are visible, but those of the upper towers are more frequented, for the ground ascends, since the city is built upon a mountain. There are steps, too, which lead up to the crossroads, and some people are always going up and others down, and they keep as far apart from each other as possible on the road because of those who are bound by the rules of purity, lest they should touch anything which is unlawful. It was not without reason that the original founders of the city built it in due proportions, for they possessed clear insight with regard as to what it required. Now, a furlong is an eighth a mile, so 200, but exactly 220 yards. This account of the measures adopted at Alexandria to prevent the depopulation of the countryside through migrations into the city is an interesting revelation that the question was as acute 2,000 years ago as it is today. Of course, we're more and more we're ruled by people who don't regard that stuff too well. For the country is extensive and beautiful. Some parts of it are level, especially the districts which belong to Samaria, as it is called, and which border on the land of the Idumeans, and other parts mountains, especially those which are contiguous to the land of Judea. The people therefore are bound to devote themselves to agriculture and the cultivation of the soil. By this means they may have a plentiful supply of crops. In this way cultivation of every kind is carried on, and in abundant harvest reaped in the whole of the aforesaid land. The cities, which are large and enjoy a corresponding prosperity, are well populated, but they neglect the country districts, since all men are inclined to a life of enjoyment, for everyone has a natural tendency towards the pursuit of pleasure. The same thing happened in Alexandria, which excels all cities in size and prosperity. Country people, by migrating from rural districts and settling in the city, brought agriculture into disrepute. And so to prevent them from settling in the city, the king issued orders that they should not stay in it for more than 20 days. In the same way, he gave the judges written instructions that if it was necessary to issue a summons against anyone who lived in the country, the case must be settled within 5 days. And since he considered the matter one of great importance, he appointed also legal officers for every district with their assistants, that the farmers and their advocates might not be in the interests of business empty in the granaries of the city. Of the produce of husbandry. I permitted this digression because it was Eleazar who pointed out with great clearness the points which have been mentioned. Society needs to do more than just set up the rituals, For great is the energy which they expend on the tillage of the soil. For the land is thickly planted with multitudes of olive trees, with crops of corn and pulse, and with vines too, and there is abundance of honey. Other kinds of fruit trees and dates do not count compared with these. There are cattle of all kinds in great quantities, and a rich pasturage for them. Wherefore they rightly recognize that the large country districts need a large population, and the relations between the city and the villages are properly regulated. A great quantity of spices and precious stones and gold is brought into the country by the Arabs, for the country is well adapted not only for agriculture but also for commerce, and the city is rich in the arts and lacks none of the merchandise which is brought across the sea. It possesses 2 suitable and commodious harbors at Ascalon, Joppa, and Gaza, as well as Ptolemais, which was founded by the king and holds a central position compared with the other places named, being not far distant from any of them. The country produces everything in abundance, since it is well watered in all directions and well protected from storms. The river Jordan, as it is called, which never runs dry, flows through the land. Originally the country contained not less than 60 million acres, though afterwards the neighboring peoples made incursions against it, and 600,000 men were settled upon it, in farms of 100 acres each. The river, like the Nile, rises in harvest time, and it irrigates a large portion of the land. Near the district belonging to the people of Ptolemais, it issues into another river, and this flows out into the sea. Other mountain torrents, as they are called, flow down into the plain and encompasses the parts about Gaza and the district of Ashdod. The country is encircled by a natural fence and is very difficult to attack and cannot be assailed by large forces, owing to the narrow passes with their overhanging precipices and deep ravines, and the rugged character of the mountainous regions which surround all the land. We were told that from the neighboring mountains of Arabia copper and iron were formerly obtained. This was stopped, however, at the time of the Persian rule, since the authorities of the time spread abroad a false report that the working of the mines was useless and expensive in order to prevent their country from being destroyed by the mining in these districts and possibly taken away from them owing to the Persian rule, since, by the assistance of this false report, they found an excuse for entering the district. I have now, my dear brother Philocrates, given you all the essential information upon this subject in brief form. I shall describe the work of translation in the sequel. The high priest selected men of the finest character and the highest culture, since, as one would expect from their noble parentage, they were men who had not only acquired proficiency in Jewish literature, but had studied most carefully that of the Greeks as well. They were specially qualified, therefore, for serving on embassies and they undertook this duty whenever it was necessary. They possessed a great felicity for conferences and the discussion of problems connected with the law. They espoused the middle course, and this is always the best course to pursue. They abjured the rough and uncouth manner, but they were altogether above pride and never assumed an air of superiority over others. And in conversation they were ready to listen and gave an appropriate answer to every question. And all of them carefully observed this rule and were anxious above everything else to excel each other in its observance. And they were, all of them, worthy of their leader and of his virtue. And one could observe how they loved Eleazar by their unwillingness to be torn away from him, and how he loved them. For besides the letter which he wrote to the king concerning their safe return, he also earnestly besought Aristeas to work for the same end, and urged me to assist to the best part of my ability. And, although we promised to give our best attention to the matter, he said that he was still greatly distressed, for he knew that the king, out of the goodness of his nature, considered it his highest privilege, whenever he heard of a man who was superior to his fellows in culture and wisdom, to summon him to his court. For I have heard of a fine saying of his, to the effect that by securing just and prudent men about his person, he would secure the greatest protection for his kingdom, since such friends would unreservedly give him the most beneficial advice. And the men who were now being sent to him by Eleazar undoubtedly possessed these qualities, and he frequently asserted upon an oath that he would never let the men go if it were merely some private interest of his own that constituted the impelling motive, but it was for the common advantage of all the citizens that he was sending them. For he explained the good life consists in the keeping of the enactments of the law, and this end is achieved much more by hearing than by reading. From this and other similar statements, it was clear what his feelings towards them were. And so we see their justification for what I do here with all these scholastic presentations, is it enables some people to hear these things that might otherwise only be able to read them, and some of the material they may not be able to get a hold of to read as well. So chapter 6 is explanations of the customs of the people, showing what is meant by the word unclean, the essence and origin of the God belief. Verses 43 and 44 give a picturesque description of the divinity of physiology. I take a lot of the divine body stuff as metaphors of how we connect with divinity, so I'm not sure what they are going to mean with all this, but this is 67 verses. It is worthwhile to mention briefly the information which he gave in reply to our questions, for I suppose that most people feel a curiosity with regard to some of the enactments in the law, especially those about meats and drinks and animals recognized as unclean. When we asked why, since there is but one form of creation, some animals are regarded as unclean for eating, and others unclean even to the touch. For though the law is scrupulous on most points, it is especially scrupulous on such matters as these. He began his reply as follows. You observe, he said, what an effect our modes of life and our associations produce upon us. By associating with the bad, men catch their depravities and become miserable throughout their life. But if they live with the wise and prudent, they find the means of escaping from ignorance and amending their lives. Our lawgiver, first of all, laid down the principles of piety and righteousness, and inculcated them point by point, not merely by prohibitions, but by the use of examples as well, demonstrating the injurious effects of sin and the punishments inflicted by God upon the guilty. For he proved first of all that there is only one God, and that his power is manifested throughout the universe, since every place is filled with his sovereignty, and none of the things which are wrought in secret by men upon the earth escapes his knowledge. For all that a man does and all that is to come to pass in the future are manifest to him. Working out these truths carefully and having made them plain, he showed that even if a man should think of doing evil, to say nothing of actually effecting it, he would not escape detection, for he made clear that the power of God pervaded the whole of the law, Beginning from his starting point, he went on to show that all mankind except ourselves believe in the existence of many gods, though they themselves are much more powerful than the beings whom they vainly worship. Well, yes and no, right? We are the physically incarnate ones. So there's that feature that we have. But even the physically incarnated things are of different powers. We can look all around us and say, well, are we the best with sight? Are we the best to be able to run about and analyze our environment and respond on the quick? No. Strongest, most secure, a lot of things. For when they have made statues of stone and wood, they say that they are the images of those who have invented something useful for life, and they worship them, though they have a clear proof that they possess no feeling. For it would be utterly foolish to suppose that anyone became a god in virtue of his inventions. For the inventors simply took certain objects already created, and by combining them together, showed that they possessed a fresh utility they did not themselves create, substance of the thing, and so it is a vain and foolish thing for people to make gods of men like themselves. For in our times there are many who are much more inventive and more learned than men of former days, who have been deified, and yet they would never come to worship them. The makers and authors of these myths think that they are the wisest of the Greeks. Why need we speak of other infatuated people, Egyptians and the like, who place their reliance upon wild beasts and most kinds of creeping things and cattle, and worship them and offer sacrifices to them, both while living and when dead? Now our lawgiver, being a wise man and especially endowed by God to understand all things, took a comprehensive view of each particular detail and fenced us round with impregnable ramparts and walls of iron, that we might not mingle at all with any other nations, but remain pure in body and soul. Well, the body and soul, obviously, are linked, but it's not whether you breed or mix or not mix. It's about what you do with these bodies and other material means. Free from all vain imaginings, worshipping the one Almighty God above the whole creation. Hence the leading Egyptian priest, having looked carefully into many matters and being cognizant with our affairs, calls us men of God. This is a title which does not belong to the rest of mankind, but only to those who worship the true God. But the rest are men not of God, but of meats and drinks and clothing, for their whole disposition leads them to find solace in these things, and are reckoned of no account. But throughout their things among our people, such whole life is their main consideration, is the sovereignty of God. Therefore, lest we should be corrupted by any abomination, or our lives be perverted by evil communications, he hedged us round on all sides by rules of purity, affecting alike what we eat or drink or touch or hear or see. For though, speaking generally, all things are alike in their natural constitution, since they are all governed by one and the same power, yet there is a deep reason in each individual case why we abstain from the use of certain things and enjoy the common use of others. For the sake of illustration, I will run over 1 or 2 points and explain them to you. For you must not fall under the degrading idea that it was out of regard to mice and weasels and other such things that Moses drew up his laws with such exceeding care. All these ordinances were made for the sake of righteousness, to aid in the quest for virtue and the perfecting of character. All the birds that we use are tame and distinguished by their cleanliness, feeding on various kinds of grain and pulse, such as, for instance, pigeons turtle doves, locusts, partridges, geese also, and all other birds of this class. But the birds which are forbidden you will find to be wild and carnivorous, tyrannizing over the others by the strength which they possess, and cruelly obtaining food by preying of the tame birds enumerated above. Now in Al-Kafi, you see a detailed explanation of the forbidden foods, the forbidden things to consume, reasoning for that, which I have mentioned in the program. And not only so, but they seize lambs and kids, and enter human beings too, whether dead or alive, and so by naming them unclean, he gave a sign by means of them that those for whom the legislation was ordained must practice righteousness in their hearts, and not tyrannize over anyone in reliance upon their own strength, nor rob them of anything, but steer their course of life in accordance with justice, just as the tame birds already mentioned consume the different kinds of pulse that grow upon the earth, and do not tyrannize to the destruction of their own kindred. And verse 25, for you must not fall into the degrading idea that it was out of regard to mice and weasels and other such things that Moses drew up his laws with such exceeding care. Could be part of the motivation for 1 Corinthians 9:9. So, because they kind of relate, don't they? Our legislator taught us, therefore, that it is by such methods as these indications are given to the wise, that they must be just and effect nothing by violence, and refrain from tyrannizing over others in reliance upon their own strength. For since it is considered unseemly even to touch such unclean animals as have been mentioned on account of their particular habits, ought we not to take every precaution lest our own characters should be destroyed in the same extent? Wherefore all the rules which he has laid down with regard to what is permitted in the case of these birds and other animals, he has enacted with the object of teaching us a moral lesson. For the division of the hoof and the separation of the claws are intended to teach us that we must discriminate between our individual actions with a view to the practice of virtue. For the strength of our whole body and its activity depend upon our shoulders and limbs. Therefore, he compels us to recognize that we must perform all our actions with discrimination according to the standard of righteousness, more especially because we have been distinctly separated from the rest of mankind. For most other men defile themselves by promiscuous intercourse, thereby working great iniquity, and whole countries and cities pride themselves upon such vices. For they not only have the intercourse with men, but they defile their own mothers and even their daughters. But we have been kept separate from such sins, and the people who have been separated in the aforementioned way are also characterized by the lawgiver as possessing the gift of memory. For all animals which are cloven-footed and chew the cud represent to the initiated the symbol of memory. For the act of chewing the cud is nothing else than the reminiscence of life and existence. For life is wont to be sustained by means of food. Wherefore he exhorts us in the Scripture, also in these words, Thou shalt surely remember the Lord that wrought in thee those great and wonderful things. For when they are properly conceived, they are manifestly great and glorious. First, the construction of the body and the disposition of the food and the separation of each individual limb, and for more, the organization of the senses, the operation and the invisible movement of the mind, the rapidity of its particular actions, and its discovery of the arts, display an infinite resourcefulness. Wherefore he exhorts us to remember that the aforesaid parts are kept together by the divine power with consummate skill, for he has marked out every time and place that we may continually remember the God who rules and preserves us. For in the matter of meats and drinks, he bids us, first of all, offer part as a sacrifice, and then forthwith enjoy our meal. Moreover, upon our garments he has given us a symbol of remembrance, and in like manner he has ordered us to put the divine oracles upon our gates and doors as a remembrance of God, and upon our hands too he expressly orders the symbol to be fastened, clearly showing that we ought to perform every act in righteousness, remembering our own creation and above all, the fear of God. He bids men also, when lying down to sleep and rising up again to meditate upon the works of God, not only in word, but by observing distinctly the change and impression produced upon them when they are going to sleep, and also their waking, how divine and incomprehensible the change from one of these states to the other is. The excellency of the analogy in regard to discrimination and memory has now been pointed out to you, according to our interpretation of the cloven hoof and the chewing of the cud. For our laws have not been drawn up at random, are in accordance with the first causal thought that occurred to the mind, but with a view to truth and the indication of right reason. For by means of the directions which he gives with regard to meats and drinks and particular cases of touching, he bids us neither to do nor listen to anything thoughtlessly, nor to resort to injustice by the abuse of the power of reason. In the case of the wild animals, too, the same principles may be discovered, for the character of the weasel and of the mice and such animals as these, which are expressively mentioned, is destructive. Mice defile and damage everything, not only for their own food, but even to the extent of rendering absolutely useless to a man whatever it falls in their way to damage. The weasel class, too, is peculiar, for besides what has been said, it has a characteristic which is defiling. It conceives through the ears, and brings forth through the mouth. That doesn't sound right. And it is for this reason that a like practice is declared unclean in men. For by embodying in speech all that they receive through the ears, they involve others in evils and work no ordinary impurity, being themselves altogether defiled by the pollution of impiety. And your king, as we are informed, does quite right in destroying such men. That, I said, I suppose you mean the informers, for he constantly exposes them to tortures and to painful forms of death. Yes, he replied. These are the men I mean, for to watch for men's destruction is an unholy thing, and our law forbids us to injure anyone either by word or deed. My brief account of these matters ought to have convinced you that all our regulations have been drawn up with a view to righteousness, and that nothing has been enacted in the Scripture thoughtlessly or without due reason, but its purpose is to enable us throughout our whole life and in all our actions to practice righteousness before all men, being mindful of Almighty God. Are they saying that the commandments were composed by men? That it wasn't quite the same as Moses, but they were... So which one's which is sort of impossible, right? And so concerning meats and things unclean, creeping things and wild beasts, the whole system aims at righteousness and righteous relationships between